Hey everyone, welcome to another video. As you've noticed, my video coverage for this patch is going to be a little bit late because of all the holiday stuff that's going on. So to make the video a little bit more interesting for Spider-Man's review, I'm going to be taking a look at how the red suit compares to the black suit in terms of PvE, and if you can even use the red suit for PvE, as well as taking a look at various different build options for Spider-Man in PvP, such as Destruction and Regen, which were the ones that I tested out firsthand, but I'm also going to be discussing the other options that he has for PvP and recommending which one I think is the best for him. Like before, these are what my card stats look like, so all my testing is based off this. Before I go into the testing, I just wanted to quickly cover some points with Spider-Man's newest uniform and some things that are kind of overlooked or that people might not know about his uniform. So one of the reasons why Spider-Man is currently so strong is because he has that 60% increased damage versus supervillains, which allows him to take down very powerful villain characters in the meta, like Doom for example. Besides that, he also has that 50% ignore damage reduction in his uniform passive, which isn't shown here, which is another reason why he's so good, because the CTP of Authority with the Mighty or Brilliant Steel effect is very popular in PvP, and Spider-Man can pretty much bypass that without having to do anything. That damage reduction ignore also works against having your damage reduced versus things like combat types, which naturally have an advantage versus Spider-Man, but with that passive he basically is able to bypass that damage reduction versus combats similar to the steel effect. When we first saw the patch notes, we saw that Spider-Man got only 0.4% damage accumulation for damage dealt on his third skill, but in reality this skill is actually a charge up skill without having the charge up option. What this means is that the 0.4% actually increases up to 0.8% and 1.2% depending on how long you stay in the skill before canceling it into other skills. Some people might be wondering why this isn't a charge up skill similar to Thor's fourth skill, for example, and it's actually quite interesting and probably better that it isn't a charge up skill, because on auto in content like Timeline, if you do it on auto, or in Alliance Conquest, the character can get the full charge up effect or the full 1.2% damage accumulation because the AI won't cancel skills, whereas if it was a charge up skill, sometimes the AI can exit out of the skill early instead of staying in the full charge. So in regards to PvP, this is actually pretty good that the skill works like it does. You can see how this works in this little testing demo that I did. If you use the third skill and cancel it instantly, you only get 0.4% of the accumulation effect. If you use the third skill for at least 1 second and then cancel into another skill, your accumulation effect will go up to 0.8%. And then if you hold it for 2 seconds and then cancel the skill, or just cancel after 2 seconds, you get the 1.2% damage accumulation effect. So if you're using a single skill damage proc and you want to cancel the skill early so that you don't activate the proc accidentally, but you want to get that full 1.2% accumulation, you can basically just look at the counter on your skill. So after you activate the skill, the timer will start and you can check there. Or you can count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and by that time is when you cancel and you can go into your other skills. The fourth skill is why Spider-Man is as good as he is in PvP, because it has a short 9-second cooldown, which goes down to 4.5 seconds with max cooldown on your cards. He also gets 20% healing, which increases even further if you have something like CTP of Regeneration in your build, and he has 70% chance to penetrate all sources. Aside from this, he's constantly removing opponents' buffs and cleansing himself from any debuffs. And most importantly of all, with the red suit, he gets ignore targeting, which means that he can pretty much hit opponents who are in iframe almost all the time. One other important thing that most people overlook with the red suit is that the fourth skill actually has super guard break on it. So those little robots that show up after he goes into the fourth skill actually stun lock the opponent, regardless of if they have guard break immunity. This is another reason why the red suit is drastically better for PvP, because besides the obvious iframe ignore that he has available every 4.5 seconds, you also have the super guard break, which the black suit doesn't have. You might have noticed that the cooldown on the 4th skill is actually higher on the black suit, going up to 12 seconds from the 9 seconds, but you also gain 30% increased attack to all skills for 6 seconds. So I wanted to see if these changes to the 4th skill meant that the black suit was far superior in PvE, or if the shorter cooldown on the 4th skill might actually allow the red suit to do PvE content as well. I've seen some people confused about Spider-Man's tier 1 passive, so just to clarify how it works, when he goes down to 40% health or lower, he gains 30% of his HP back, and he goes invisible and gains a 75% chance to basically take no damage. The ignore targeting means that he's also in iframe in this period. So again, that bottom part means that he basically has 75% chance to take no damage, and the ignore targeting just means that he's in an iframe during that time, so opponents can only hit him if they have that iframe ignore effect. One of the other things that people might have overlooked with the new uniforms is that the base stats have also increased compared to the previous uniforms. So if you looked at the base stats with the previous uniforms equipped, Spider-Man's physical attack was around the 9.2 thousand mark, his physical defense and energy defense was around the 7,000 mark, and his HP was around the 24,000 mark. If you compare that with the newest uniforms, his physical attack increases by 3,000 roughly, physical defense around 3,000 as well, energy defense around 2,000, and his HP a whopping 10,000. The reason why I'm even mentioning the base stats is because when he had that low 24,000 base HP, it was a little bit difficult to recommend using something like CTP of Regeneration, because that health shield is based off the HP total that you have. So if you have low HP, then that shield won't really do too much. But with the uniform increasing that up another 10,000, his HP pool is actually pretty good for speed type, and you can use a CTP of Regeneration pretty effectively. Last thing that I wanted to touch on is the artifact, and although I don't have it myself, so I haven't tested it firsthand, I can actually get it if I wanted to, since I do have a selector, but from the teams that I have fought, it does make a difference, but it's not very significant in the sense that it changes the character in how they perform, similar to something like Gilgamesh or Hela or even Heimdall, I would say. So fortunately for most people, this artifact isn't a must, but it does help since it calculates the chance to dodge an attack differently from the dodge stat on the character, or at least it seems like that in the way that it works. By the way, for anyone wondering, I did also take Spider-Man into Alliance Battle Extreme for the Speed Hero Day, and I ended up scoring about 7.5 million with a CTP of Destruction and an unfinished build, meaning no Urus or anything like that. Funny enough, when I finished my build equipping Urus and Odins and switched to a CTP of Regen for testing that, I did end up scoring the exact same score, so that kind of gives you an idea of how much of a difference Urus and Odins make in your build. I would guess that if you go for a full PvE build with a solid rotation, you could probably score in the 8.5 to 9 million range pretty consistently. If you're wondering what Spider-Man's basic rotation is, you simply do the 3rd skill and cancel it after about 2 seconds, and then you go into your 4th skill, instantly cancel that, and then proc on the 5th skill. Then when you have your ultimate, you do the same thing, but you go 3, delay cancel into 4, cancel 6th skill or the ultimate, and then 5. If you want to do a more advanced version of the rotation to fill up the ultimate faster, you can do 2 cancel, 1 cancel, 3 delay cancel, 4 cancel, 5. If you're going for a PvE build, then the CTP of Energy is more than likely your best option, since most of his skills can be cancelled and layered on top of one another, and you have one long skill that you want to proc on, i.e. the 5th skill. If you want to go for a hybrid build, which I believe is his most popular build for people that want to use him in PvE and PvP, it would be obviously a CTP of Destruction, and if you have the Reforge option, it would be with the Strike option, so the one that gives you the increased damage versus bosses. Anyways, with the black suit, stage 99 of Thanos takes about 2 minutes to complete. By the way, for those wondering, all of the world boss tests that I did are with a CTP of destruction with only damage as the reforged effect. By the way, for those wondering, the web that ignores immunity does work on all world bosses, with the exception of world boss legend, villains, and Thanos' second phase when it goes into that red arena. With the red suit, the rotation is almost the same as the black one. The only difference is that after you use the fourth skill, instead of instantly canceling, you wait till he kind of walks through the opponent to cancel into your fifth skill. So using the red suit, I was able to complete the same stage, but this time 18 seconds slower. But because the fight went so fast, I also wanted to take him into World Boss Legend to give you a better gauge of the difference between the two uniforms. For the first World Boss Legend test, I took Spider-Man into stage 24 of Knull, and surprisingly enough, I wasn't actually able to finish this fight with the red suit, leaving about 2 health bars remaining when the time was over. With the black suit equipped, I was able to reach that 2 health bar mark about 35 seconds faster than I was able to with the red suit equipped. So you can see that besides being able to actually clear stage 24 of Knull, which I'm pretty sure I might have been able to with the red suit, it does perform about 35 seconds faster at the very least. Repeating the same test, but this time for Mephisto, the red suit takes about 60 seconds to clear stage 24. Unsurprisingly, because of the damage buffs from the black suit as well as the type advantage versus Mephisto, those stacking buffs allowed the black suit to pull ahead even further versus the red one, since I was able to complete stage 24 60 seconds faster than the red suit with about 2 minutes remaining. But besides the fact that the black suit is clearly better for PvE, the point of these tests was to give you an idea of how the red suit performs in case that is the only one that you could afford and you wanted to use something like a hybrid build on Spider-Man to be able to use him in PvP, but also leverage his usability in PvE. Speaking of destruction, I've seen a lot of people ask what the best build is for Spider-Man, and the answer is that there really isn't a best build. It really depends on what you're building him for. That is going to end up being the best build for you. Before I discuss the pros and cons of each build and which one you might want to go with, just keep in mind that these clips that you are seeing in the background is with CTP of Destruction on my Spider-Man, and just notice the health that I have on the character with these tests compared to the regen that I will show a little bit after. Going into the build recommendations, if you want to use Spider-Man as a hybrid, being useful in PvE and PvP, then a CTP of Destruction with that strike effect is likely your best option. Even though you won't be able to make use of the penetration from the CTP of Destruction, that strike effect, coupled with the fact that Spider-Man works very well with a single skill damage proc, will allow you to make use of the character in both PvE and PvP. You can potentially also use a CTP of Greed with or without the Reforge, and that will also allow you to use him in PvE and PvP, but because the proc continues on a cycle on and off, it likely won't perform as well as a reforged CTP of Destruction with that strike effect. Also, if you're wondering if the ambush effect stacks up with Spider-Man's uniform passive, unfortunately I can't really test that because there's way too many factors involved for me to be able to see if it does stack or it doesn't. Regardless, it shouldn't really matter because the 50% that he gets from his uniform passive should be more than enough, and you likely won't really notice too much of a difference with the ambush effect on. I would say that it likely would only really make a difference if you're facing an opponent that has multiple supports stacked on to reduce your damage even further. So if you're fighting something like a combat type with Colossus support or something like that. If you want to use Spider-Man specifically for PvP though, I would probably say that a CTP of Regen or a CTP of Authority, depending on your cards and how much health you have available to you, are likely the best builds for that. Between recommending a CTP of Authority or Regen is a little bit tricky since it usually comes down to preference, and most often these two CTPs perform very close to one another. By the way, if you're wondering how I was able to kill Wolverine and Hela, even though they have their artifacts that makes them unkillable, it's because of the Challenger buffs that are available only in Timeline Challenger. You can see in this next clip, without those buffs and still with the CTP of Destruction, what generally happens versus characters like Wolverine. But like I said before, you can make an argument for either CTP of Authority or Regen. They largely perform the same. I personally tried out the CTP of Regen first because he has that higher base HP now. He spams that 4th skill frequently, which has healing on it. And lastly, his tier 1 passive gives him 30% healing when he's under that 40% health mark. You can see in this clip that although a hybrid build is good, versus tough combat types that have good survival, you will struggle with a CTP of Destruction. That's why I switched to a CTP of Regeneration, which is what these following clips are showing. Because I was able to take down any opponent with a damage proc, I just needed to be able to outsurvive the combat types that had very good survival. And if you pay attention to the health on these clips, you'll see that unlike the CTP of Destruction tests, I, for the most part, don't fall under 50% health in these tests. And you'll also see that the previous test that I did, where I lost against Wolverine, with a CTP of Regeneration or any other kind of survival or defensive based build, you will be able to better survive versus combat types that can potentially counter you one-on-one. If you set up your team right in your sports, so you basically match up with your opponents, you should be able to take out any combat type with Spider-Man even without having a damage proc. That 50% damage reduction ignore that Spider-Man has on his uniform passive will allow you to kind of counteract the type disadvantage that you have when facing combat types. Also, if you notice me almost dying with a CTP of Regeneration on, you can imagine what would happen if I had a CTP of Destruction on instead. In terms of a CTP of Authority being better than Regen, again, that depends on your cards and builds. If you don't have a lot of health, then a CTP of Authority will easily outperform a CTP of Regen in that sense. You could potentially make an argument that a mighty CTP of Authority with that steal effect could be very good for Spider-Man because he has no mitigations whatsoever in his kit. He solely relies on the dodge, healing, and evading attacks to be able to survive. So if he does get hit with a very strong character, even with that CTP of Regeneration, he does have the potential to get one shot, but with a CTP of Authority, it's more likely that he probably won't get one shot because that damage mitigation from the steal effect will activate to kind of keep that from happening. But besides that, the opponent will also have to have penetration in their kit in order to go through the invincible right away. As you'll see in this clip, another reason why CTP of Authority might be better is that the strike effect makes you immune to super guard break, which is very important because Spider-Man heavily relies on going into his 4th skill to evade attacks and survive. And if he's head rocked, he won't be able to do that and will basically just get hit a bunch of times and end up dying. Which is actually one of the things that I've noticed in Alliance Conquest, where there is a lot of opponents that can iframe and hit him at the same time to knock him out of his skills. So just to summarize, between a CTP of Regen and a CTP of Authority, either option is very good for Spider-Man for PvP, and it's more than likely the preferred option if you are trying to use him as a dedicated PvP character. In terms of content like Alliance Conquest, I kind of suspect that a CTP of Authority might be a safer option for him, since he, again, heavily relies on his 4th skill, and if he gets head rocked, i.e. with a guard break or super guard break, then he can't do that. But with the steal effect on a CTP of Authority, or even when the proc activates, he gets that ability to not be guard broken, which gives him more chances to go into his rotation and avoid damage. The other thing to note is that the CTP of Authority also gives him damage accumulation when he's hit, which doesn't conflict with the damage accumulation for the damage that he deals. So you can potentially get even more damage built up to counter combat types with a CTP of Authority. Regardless, I don't really think you can go wrong with either of those options. Speaking of Alliance Conquest, I did take him there with my Regen build to see how he would do as a solo character. I initially took him up against teams that he was very good against, so that would be villain types, and especially blast villain types. As you can see, he drops around the 50% health mark a couple times here, so that invincible and shield build is essential for him. The second team that I took him up against is all villains, and this time it's versus Doom. Since he did so well in Timeline versus him, I wanted to see if he would do just as well in Alliance Conquest, and that seems to be the case. Even with the opposing team having 2 supports to increase Doom's survival and damage. For this next test, I took Spider-Man up against characters that weren't necessarily villains, and even though the zone is kind of bombed, so the enemies are at less than half health, the purpose of the test was more so to see if Spider-Man could survive long enough, more so than actually winning the fight by himself. The reason I even did this test is because it was a challenge for him, considering that Sentry and Blue Marvel both have a lot of super guard break, and Sentry iframes a lot with his first skill, I believe, and besides that, Knull has that unkillable passive as well as his iframe ignore, which can potentially one-shot you. But as you can see, Regen, especially with the penetration option on it like mine, is enough to keep him alive in fights like this. The last test that I did was to see if Spider-Man could handle a strong combat type in a 3 vs 3 setting, especially one that had an iframe ignore as well. Although I don't recommend doing this, because you never know what kind of skills the opponent might use, and you might unnecessarily lose the character, I mainly took him into this test to see if he could actually survive for a good amount of time with the regen, let alone actually winning the fight like the last one. As you can see though, that 4th skill with the super guard break is pretty good for locking down most opponents, and he survives long enough to go into his ultimate. In terms of ways to counter Spider-Man, there's actually plenty, because they didn't give him damage mitigation in his kit. So that means that if you have characters that can iframe a lot, or that have very high burst damage in iframes, they can potentially wipe him out pretty easily. So as you saw in the previous clip, Warriors of the Sky are capable of doing that. Other teams that can take him out are the Defenders, especially because he's very susceptible to reflect damage when he goes into his 5th skill particularly. But besides that, Luke Cage and Daredevil both have iframe ignores, with Daredevil having that very high burst damage with his own iframe ignore. Other potential counters can also be Hulk and Quicksilver, because he immediately goes into his 4th skill, which is that high burst damage and iframe ignore skill. All in all, this is an amazing upgrade for Spider-Man, though he isn't as OP as some might have thought in a 3 vs 3 setting, specifically because he doesn't have that damage mitigation in his kit. But regardless, he is definitely a character worth getting and upgrading. I did test Black Cat and Kingpin with PvP builds, so those are the next ones that I'm going to be looking at. If you liked the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have a question or want to say something. And as always, thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.